Good afternoon, everyone. Excellencies, honored delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you to the side event organized by UNIDIR's Middle East Weapons of Mass Destruction-Free Zone Project. I still have a bit of an echo here. Perhaps we could...
I think it comes from...
Yeah, I think it's from the PC there. So I'm very happy to be joined today by Ambassador Silvio Gonzato, Chargé d'Affaires ad interim for the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, who I would like to thank very much on behalf of UNIDIR for the EU's support of UNIDIR's activities in general and the very generous support for the project in particular. We'll have an opportunity to hear from him very shortly. Today's side event will present findings from UNIDIR's forthcoming publication, Narratives of the Middle East WMD-Free Zone, Historical Accounts, Drivers, and Themes. The Zone project team has been working on this workstream for over 2 years, and this comprehensive monograph should be published in the coming months. To capture some of the main findings of this work, you will find on your desks a brochure that captures some of the report's main elements. And in addition, we're very fortunate to be joined here today by 4 leading experts who have had a chance to read portions of the report and who will be able to speak on it based on their own considerable experience gained over many years of dealing with the topic. This publication will be one of the most comprehensive works ever written on the nearly 50-year effort to create a Middle East WMD-free zone. We hope it'll be a meaningful contribution to the field and help inform the work of diplomats engaged on this topic, particularly those taking part in the conference on the establishment of a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. This conference has held so far 2 sessions in November 2019 and November-December 2021, respectively, as well as intersessional meetings. It has made substantive progress towards the establishment of a zone, and this momentum will hopefully have positive influence on the NPT Review Conference. With so many challenges in the international non-proliferation regime and environment, it is good to be able to highlight some positive developments as well. As many of you may recall, we launched this project here at the UNGA back when it was still possible to meet in person nearly 3 years ago. The project, to recall, aims first to fill research gaps, including lessons learned on the Middle East WMD-free zone, to build analytic capacity to support new thinking on the WMD-free zone, collect ideas, and develop new proposals on how to move forward, and last but certainly not least, to foster inclusive dialogue on the zone. Reflecting on these last 3 years, and despite the challenges posed by the COVID pandemic, the project has held over 15 events with over 700 participants and from 77 different countries. It also published 9 reports and 2 online tools, the timeline of milestones and document depository, all of which, as always with UNIDIR, can be accessed through the project website and the QR codes on the brochure. Many of these reports have also been translated into Arabic, Hebrew, and Persian. Being at the NPT RevCon, the topic of the Middle East WMD-Free Zone always maintained a strong connection to the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference cycle. The Middle East resolution was an important element of the package to indefinitely extend the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1995. This laid a foundation on which the states of the Middle East and NPT depository states have repeatedly attempted to create a zone. Unfortunately, the zone issue has in the past been a topic of lengthy and often heated discussions, and at times was the reason why consensus could not be attained. The work of the conference on the establishment of a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction may change this perceived dynamic. There are signs that the zone issue may be less contentious at the 10th Review Conference than past RevCons, and could instead be a positive factor contributing to building a better atmosphere at the conference. We at UNIDIR certainly hope that this will be the case, and we wish you every success in the work ahead. With that, I would like to give the floor to Ambassador Gonzato from the EU to share his remarks, and followed by my UNIDIR colleague, Dr. Zak, to kick off the discussion on the narratives publication. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Robin, and I'll be very short. And apologize in advance because I need to leave immediately after my remarks, but my colleagues are here in the room and following closely the discussion, the discussion that I hope will be fruitful and constructive on this important topic where, first of all, I would like to thank UNIDIR for the role you're playing in promoting research on these issues, but also dialogue, and therefore promoting a better environment for progress, for making progress on this important topic, a topic where the EU remains strongly committed. Our commitment goes back to a decision taken by the foreign ministers back in 2019 to promote dialogue amongst the countries concerned in order to achieve the establishment of a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. This is the project that you'll be discussing today, I think, has the merit of trying to understand the different positions, the different narratives underlying these issues, and therefore create a basis for a more constructive and more fruitful dialogues between the different counterparts involved. And we remain strongly committed to this process. It's great to see that we can gather again in person here in New York after the chasm that was imposed upon us by the pandemic. I think it's important that we use this opportunity to the best of our abilities and contribute to making further progress on this important issue. And with this, I hand you over, back over to you, and I wish you a very interesting and constructive discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Geis and Ambassador Gonzato, for your welcome remarks and kicking off our event. I especially want to thank again the European Union for all your support for the project and believing in the Middle East where so many others stopped to believe. We are very pleased to finally be here at the 10th Review Conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but also for the opportunity to make our event accessible to anyone that is interested in the Middle East weapon of mass destruction-free zone. One of the few positive aspects of the pandemic was our ability to reach greater audience and engage with people that typically will not be able to travel or attend such an event. With that, I want to extend warm welcome to our virtual audience. We have over 200 people right now that are joining us virtually, and as such, the event is recorded, and we will take questions from our distinguished guests here in the room, as well as our virtual audience at the end of the panel discussion. It is my pleasure to have here with us today 5 experts to discuss the Middle East weapon of mass destruction-free zone. And this is also an opportunity to give you a glance, as Dr. Geis mentioned, of our forthcoming publication titled The Narratives of the Middle East Weapon of Mass Destruction-Free Zone, Historical Accounts, Drivers, and Themes. We have been working on this publication for a long time now and expect to have it published in the upcoming month. You will find in your seats the brochure that summarizes some of the key elements of the publication, and if you're not able to pick up a physical brochure, a digital infographic is available in our, to be downloaded on our UNIDIR Middle East Weapon of Mass Destruction-Free Zone event page. Our speakers today bring with them ample of knowledge and expertise on the zone. We'll concentrate today on 4 of the main negotiation forums where the zone has been discussed in the past, and the evolving regional security environment in the region today, and how those might influence the current process and any future processes. With that, I will turn to introduce our speakers in the order that they will be speaking today. Dr. Farzan Sabat, a researcher in UNIDIR Middle East Weapon of Mass Destruction-Free Zone project, will discuss the publication we are pre-launching today and its main finding. Dr. Hannah Notte, a senior researcher associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, will discuss lessons from the Arms Control and Regional Security Working Group in the 1990s. Mr. Tom Markram, the Director and Deputy of the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs at the UN in New York, will discuss lessons from previous NPT Review Conference and the informal consultation follow the 2010 NPT Review Conference. Ambassador Wael El-Assad, a senior advisor to the Qatari National Committee for the Prohibition of Weapons, as well as a senior fellow with UNIDIR Middle East Weapon of Mass Destruction Project, will discuss the current conference on the establishment of Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. And last but definitely not least, Dr. Ali Vaez, Crisis Group Iran Project Director and Senior Advisor to the President, will discuss the current evolving regional security environment and how it can influence and inform the zone process. We want to have the event today more a conversation rather than a reading long statements, although it's very hard to do it in this kind of a room format. But we will start with our speaker. I will ask them several questions, and I will pose them before we turn to the Q&As. But we really encourage you to ask questions as well as our audience in virtual. With that, let me turn to our first panelist, Dr. Farzan Sabat. Farzan, please tell us a little bit more about the publication that we have been working for the last 2 years on. What was the objectives, what was the methodology, and why we have been doing it?
Thank you very much, Ren, for that kind introduction. Thank you, Robin and Ambassador Gonzato, for the mise en scène, and for all of you for joining us. So the narrative publications explores important historical accounts, drivers, and themes that key states or their interlocutors have held about the Middle East WMD-Free Zone. For this publication, we've interviewed around 80 current and former officials, as well as experts, from 20 states, mostly from the Middle East region, as well as regional and international organizations. Based on these interviews, we've written 5 narratives or chapters covering the countries of the League of Arab States, Iran, Israel, the United States, and Russia. Now, the unique narratives format is a subjective account that reflect these 5 perspectives of the zone. This means that the chapters are written from the perspective of interviewees from these states, although I should mention that all the interviews were off the record and not for attribution. Before I proceed, I have to emphasize that these narrative chapters do not represent the official positions of states on the zones. You can find those positions in official statements and talking points. Now, moving on the kind of some of the actual substance, detailed substance of the publication, the novelty and insight of this publication, I think, comes from the effort to tell stories from the zone from a multitude of viewpoints emerging from these 5 key states over nearly 5 decades. So some of you might be familiar with the Akira Kurosawa film Rashomon, in which 4 characters give subjective, alternative, and contradictory versions of the very same event. Well, this is sometimes what we found during our interviews. Different people understood and recalled the very same events and set of circumstances very differently, while also assigning different motivations to the other participants present at these same events. And of course, to kind of balance that, we also included official documents and secondary literature where relevant to kind of supplement and deepen some of that substance. Now, in terms of the kind of foundations of the narratives publication, we focused on specific historical events in the history of the zone. And these are just examples, but like the 1974 and 2018 UN General Assemblies, 1995, 2010, and 2015 NPT Review Conferences, the 1990s Arms Control and Regional Security, or ACRS Working Group, of the Madrid Peace Process, the Glion Geneva Informal Consultations, and the Conference on the Establishment of a Middle East Zone Free of Nuclear Weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, which, for brevity here, I'm going to be referring to as the November Conference, based on the decision of the participating states to hold it annually on the 3rd week of each November here at the United Nations headquarters in New York. The publication ultimately seeks to facilitate insights and understanding of different viewpoints on the Middle East WMD-Free Zone, which in turn could assist us in bridging gaps, uncovering cases of convergence, divergence, and possible misunderstandings between the states on the zone. We aspire for this publication to hopefully become a lasting contribution to the field on the zone, and hope it'll provide diplomats as well as other interested parties working on the zone issue a document they can reference to gain deeper insights and knowledge of it. an understanding of why past processes failed, but also when they worked well, and what were the factors that contributed to this success. So that kind of gives you a general idea of it.
Thank you. Farzan, you mentioned the publication explored the drivers and theme in the Middle East weapon of mass destruction free zone. Can you share with us what's your findings?
Yeah, so when examining these historical accounts and events, one of the things we've sought to reveal is what drives the policies and actions of states of the Middle East, as well as extra-regional actors on the zone. We've outlined 4 main drivers, which are also included in the brochure. As I'll emphasize again after, this is not exclusive to these 4 drivers, but just for illustrative purposes. One driver is the perils of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons and delivery systems, particularly in the context of the long history of the Middle East as one of the regions where WMD proliferation has occurred most frequently and where we've actually had WMD use. The second driver one of the second drivers we discuss are viewpoints of regional security dynamics and how they relate to threats posed by weapons of mass destruction. For example, the interplay of Middle Eastern states' conventional and non-WMD unconventional capabilities, and balancing that and the interplay of that with the desire by some states to acquire WMD themselves. A third driver we discuss is the role of self-perception, bilateral ties, legacies of conflict, and ideational factors, such as how states view the acquisition of WMD by themselves or others as affecting their perceived stature and leadership role in the region vis-a-vis other states of the region, as well as extra-regional actors. And of course, the interest of global powers and the health of international WMD arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation regimes, including how progress, or lack thereof, on the zone can reinforce or weaken international WMD regimes. Now, we also explore recurring themes in the narratives that we heard from interviewees, especially those that we found clustered in many of the narratives. So there are themes that we kept hearing coming again and again and again in different narratives, although sometimes from different viewpoints. Some examples of themes include the causes for failure of past WMD processes. For example, the view by all states of the region of the unwillingness of their counterparts to either sufficiently expand or narrow the scope of zone processes and negotiations in order to keep them going. The preferred pathway to pursue a zone, including a dichotomy between those who sought international pathways, like the UN General Assembly or NPT review cycles, versus those favoring a regional pathway, and possible compromises between these two positions. Third, the effect of the transformation of the Middle East regional security environment on the zone, including normalization of ties between one set of states or some sets of states, as well as increasing tensions between shifting regional blocs on the other. And fourth, the question of the responsibility of extra-regional actors for the lack of progress, unfulfilled promises, and double standards on the zone, including the perception of some states that the failure of depository states, or the perceived failure of depository states, to fulfill their commitments on the 1995 Middle East resolution could, at some point in the future, put the independent extension of the NPT at risk. These are of course just some examples, and we've elaborated further in the publication.
Thank you, Farzan. Hannah, what was the Arms Control and Regional Security Working Group, and what was its significance to the zone discussions today?
Thank you, Ren. Hello, everyone. I will take us back 30 years. The Arms Control and Regional Security Working Group, which is also known as ACRS, is perhaps one of the more obscure precedents that we're discussing today, so let me just go into it a little bit. ACRS was an outcome of the 1991 Madrid Peace Conference, alongside 4 other multilateral working groups, which were all intended to complement bilateral negotiations after Madrid between Israel on the one hand and the Palestinians, Jordan, and Syria on the other hand. So between 1991 and 1995, in ACRS, you had 13 Arab states, Israel, the Palestinians, and a number of extra-regional states and organizations convening in what became over 40 meetings on conceptual and operational arms control and confidence-building measures in the Middle East. Now, importantly, there wasn't full participation. Syria and Lebanon declined to participate at the time because they did not want to appear to be normalizing their relations with Israel prior to the resolution of their outstanding bilateral issues. Iran, Iraq, and Libya were not invited to join the process because at that time it was considered a bridge too far. Now, ACRS became possible 30 years ago because of a combination of geopolitical and regional factors. So the stars aligned at that time for such a process, so to say. With the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, as well as the display of overwhelming US power in the first Gulf War, US leadership was at an all-time high. And though Russia was formally a co-gavel holder of this ACRS process and was perceived to have played a constructive and important role in the process, nonetheless, American leadership was considered absolutely instrumental for getting ACRS off the ground and sustaining it over time. The US also had sufficient leverage to get Israel to the table in Madrid, which was important. Then there were some other enabling factors. Internationally, the early 90s were generally a period where things were moving on the non-proliferation agenda. There was great optimism. And then regionally, the first Gulf War and the discovery of WMD in Iraq had basically underscored that there was a real risk of use of WMD in armed conflict, which elevated the arms control issue on the agenda of everyone. Now, what's the significance of this? It happened 30 years ago to the zone process today. Yes, these talks happened in a different Middle East. Key regional actors were absent, as I said. But still, this marked the first comprehensive regional conversation on arms control and security. So if we look at its inception, the way that the process was designed, and the substantive fault lines that emerged over time, this can be very instructive for the zone process today. We at the James Martin Center, CNS, together with the Wilson Center in Washington, have engaged in an oral history of the ACRS process over the last 2 years, interviewing over 40 former diplomats and delegates who negotiated in these ACRS talks to bring to light some of those lessons. And perhaps I'll just give you one example now. There were certain procedural decisions taken in ACRS to mitigate an Israeli fear that it would automatically find itself isolated against an Arab majority, to mitigate an Arab reluctance to appear to be directly negotiating with Israel, and to make sure that you can have timely progress on the less difficult issues. Those procedural decisions included, for instance, adopting a seminar-type approach initially in these negotiations to learn from arms control experiences in other regions, to split the negotiation substance into a conceptual and an operational basket, to adopt the maxim that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, to adopt the rule of consensus for all decisions, and finally, to keep this process informal with no official records taken. And of course, these various procedural decisions had advantages and disadvantages that played out over time. We can study those today, and they can be instructive to the zone process. There are other lessons, but perhaps I'll stop here.
Thank you, Hannah. Can you bring us or take us back to the past a little bit and speak about the main position of key states during ACRS, and how did they change over time?
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with ACRS, of course, was that the key parties hoped to get different things out of this process. So if we just go quickly through the main players, Egypt's main goal was to advance a conversation on Israeli nuclear disarmament and achieve a parity in obligations, so to get Israel to sign up to the NPT eventually. Whereas for the Israelis, it was very clear regional security first, arms control second. So Israel was willing to engage in a conversation on regional security, which meant confidence-building measures to mitigate the risks of unintended conflict in the region, but doing so in this process without affording the Egyptians a venue to push Israel onto what it considered a slippery slope in a discussion on nuclear disarmament. Now, for Jordan and the Gulf states, and this is where it gets complicated, they really saw ACRS, this process, as a complement to the bilateral talks that Israel was having with the Palestinians, with Jordan and Syria, and they didn't want ACRS to take precedent over that bilateral track. The United States, as a chief architect, really envisioned this to be a long-term process in which all the regional parties would develop a vision, a shared vision of what's at the end of the road, build trust, develop confidence-building measures over time. But basically, as a result of these multiple and varying objectives, you have these two fault lines characterizing ACRS, so to say. One tension between these bilaterals and the multilateral track. Various countries, Jordan, the Gulf states, just did not want work in the multilaterals to speed ahead while nothing was happening on the bilateral track. So that just shows you the problematic when you tie broader regional issues to an arms control process and the dilemmas that that can create. The second tension was that between arms control and regional security. Israel saw this basket split between the operational and the conceptual basket as a means to advance the conversation on regional security. Now, Egypt was happy to go along with that split in the spirit of being flexible on tactics, as long as the split would yield a serious discussion on Israel's nuclear arsenal. And the Egyptians, I would say by 1994, 1995, just concluded that this was not going to happen. So you ask me, did these positions change over time? Well, there's differing views if you ask the delegates today. I think with hindsight, the Egyptians feel that the Israeli reluctance to put the nuclear issue on the table was immovable. It was static. US officials who were involved in the process have nuanced views. They saw some tentative steps here and there in the process, like a readiness to discuss nuclear-related verification as perhaps being indicative of progress, but then they would admit that one step forward was followed by steps back. So there's sort of differing views on whether positions changed over time or were altogether static.
Thank you. Taking us 30 years forward, Tom, what was the objectives of the Glion Geneva informal consultation, and what were the lessons learned as somebody that were involved in them to current and future processes?
Thanks, Ken, and thanks for the invitation. Pursuant to the 2010 Review Conference decision, the conveners, which were the three depository states of the NPT and the UN, were then tasked to work with a facilitator to try and get the arrangements done for the conference. So essentially what the Glion Geneva process was about was to get those arrangements done, to have the conference convened. I mean, I think the significance of it was that it did reaffirm the consensus amongst the states of the region about establishing the Middle East zone. I think the other thing about it was that there was basically general agreement on some of the important parameters amongst the participants in terms of reference, decision-making, participation, things like that. On lessons learnt, I think the most important lesson that I saw out of the whole process was the viability of direct level consultations. States of the region will be able to get together and to directly engage with each other on matters that affected not only their own national security, but also regional security. I think there were some benefits to having a facilitator. The facilitator had the ability to table a compromise, sort of zero draft, in a situation where there were divergences on initial positions of the parties, and it could provide a suitable basis for any discussion. I think there was a challenge in relying on the depositories to facilitate and to convene a process like this. I mean, I think the pros are that those four convening states met many, many times. I mean, I think there's a lack of appreciation of how many times those groups actually met to actually talk outside the confine of the Middle East states about how to prepare, how to think, how to support. I think as conveners, they could be seen as both as a means of pressuring the other parties to participate in a constructive manner by tabling their own proposals. The downside of this is there were sometimes divergent views amongst them as well, and this did have a constraining element a little bit on procedures. I think the importance was specifying the right mandate. I think the objective of convening a conference translated the consultative process into becoming almost entirely consumed about discussing the mandate, and that is something which the current conference doesn't have. I think there was more need for direct ownership by the states of the region. I mean, the burden being placed on the conveners to design a suitable process is one thing that they were supposed to do, but I think having direct proposals from the states was a far more expeditious way of getting things done. I think consistency amongst the delegations and the level of delegations, one of the lessons I think from this was we had these 5 meetings and there were changes amongst delegations. I think in any current process going forward, if you're going to be spending a long time on this business, the more consistency you have amongst the delegations on the level and the people actually participating, the better result you're going to get. Diplomats come and go, so this is something that I think was another lesson. Personalities obviously play a big factor in these things as well. And then institutional knowledge versus baggage. I think having people around that have been in the business and know the business, it says a lot for institutional knowledge. I include myself amongst one of those dinosaurs. But it also means that people have entrenched positions when they come to these meetings. I think if I look at what's being done now in the current annual conference process, we have a situation where we're having these sort of seminars and workshops to support that process. And for the first time, you're getting a much better gender balance to begin with, and you're getting a lot more younger people to participate that don't have that kind of baggage, don't have those entrenched positions, and are also trying to, mainly from a technical point of view, come to grasp what the problem is and try and come up with solutions. And I think that is also a lesson that can be taken out of the sort of Glion Geneva process. But it was a process that did bring all the states of the region together. As it was said, ACRS was the only previous time we did it 30 years before, and they could directly engage. And I think for that, the process actually was a very worthwhile process.
Thank you, Tom. And bringing us to today's word, well, what is the Conference on the Establishment of a Middle East Zone Free of Nuclear Weapons and Other Weapons of Mass Destruction, and what been achieved so far?
Yes. Thank you, Chen. I think the history is very short from 2018 up till now, so it won't take long. And most of the people around here know how it started, how the issue was returned back to the General Assembly. In 2018, the Arab group sponsored a draft decision to task the UN back with the obligation of holding a conference, a yearly conference, an annual conference, to draft a treaty for the zone, and that this conference will be held annually until the task is done. I realized that many people were wondering, we have that issue in the review process, why take it to the General Assembly? And some people were a little bit unhappy with that. I find that we tend to forget over these long decades of discussions of the zone, of non-proliferation and disarmament, that the issue originally came to the General Assembly in 1974, the zone issue. And it remained there in spite of the fact that it went to other venues and to other forums. The issue of the zone is discussed in the General Assembly every year. So it's not very strange, but taking it back to to hold a conference under the UN banner was important to the Arab group who co-sponsored this decision. And that's because it stemmed out partly That's not the only reason, but partly out of their frustration with the developments and the events happening in the review process. They had the 1995 resolution, and they were very enthusiastic about it, and they wanted to move forward, and whoever wasn't part of the NPT joined the NPT from the Arab group because of it, and they all became part of it, and then nothing happened. Excuses were given to them. And they felt a little bit cheated with this process that promised them the 1995 resolution for the zone and became part of the package of the indefinite extension of the treaty, and then nothing happened until 2010. And again, they managed, for a number of reasons relating to the international environment at the time in 2010, not only the Middle East, there was approval to hold a conference in 2012. So, again, hope, and there are people here who attended with Tom and me the Glion process, the Geneva Glion process, and the discussions. And of course, we all here have, I'm sure if you listen to all of us, you will have divergent views on what really happened there. So, frustration. But not only frustration. There are lessons learned that drove the Arab group, at least they felt so, to go back to the General Assembly and to go back under the banner of the UN. Because as good as informal and no record kept meetings are useful in creating dialogue, they can have diverse effects when they fail, and then you get different narratives clashing and frustration of what has happened. There are no records of what happened, and it creates sometimes misunderstandings. So not all dialogue has been. So they went there for these reasons and others. Now, we had two conferences. I have to admit that the outcome of these two conferences are much better than I expected personally. They have agreed on a number of things. They had a political declaration coming out of it. They agreed on rules of procedure in the second conference. They are moving maybe to some people it's a bit slow, but maybe it's even going good enough, because this is in our understanding and in the understanding of the Arab group, and I think the rest is a long-term process. This is not going to, we're not going to finish a treaty in 1 year or 2 years. So there has been very good, from my point of view, outcomes. They created a working intersessional group to activate the ideas and to discuss and look at the issues. Of course, the main drawback to this process is, unfortunately, the US and Israel decided to boycott this process and not to be part of it. Still, the participants in the conference kept the door open for them to jump in on the wagon whenever they feel they can come in. I'll stop here. I tend to speak a lot, so you can cut me anytime you feel.
I'm actually going back to you now, and I'm going to ask you another question. For your personal experience, and I think Tom called us dinosaurs, but I will not quote him on that. In the NPT Review Conference, Glion, Geneva, and other forums, what do you think are the most important lessons that participants in the current process or any future process should take into consideration, and what do you think needs to be done to support the process?
Lessons learned, you mean?
Yep.
Okay. Well, there are a few lessons. I don't know were they learned or not. Are we learning from whatever lessons we're getting or not? But this is my personal view. The first lesson, I think we cannot have any more informal, no records kept meetings without having a formal process to support it. We always talked about track 2 is only useful when there is a track one, when there is an informal. But if there isn't a formal process, the track two can be counterproductive sometimes, can create misunderstandings, not necessarily understanding. So the formal process is more important. And I don't understand why no records kept up till now. I know this is the request of certain countries, but it doesn't help. It only helped in creating different narratives that UNIDIR has done a fantastic job, actually, in bringing all the narratives together, where you can at least attempt to have a more rounded one story, because the contradictions between the narratives create misunderstanding. So we really need to look at this issue of informal versus the formal meeting. The second issue, and I hope you will excuse me, I'm not as diplomatic as my colleagues. I tend to speak a little bit my mind here, is the role of the three depository states. They are essential. They have responsibilities towards the zone. They were the co-sponsors of the resolution in 1995. But in a perfect world, they wouldn't be biased. They wouldn't bring their own agendas. They wouldn't have their own interests. But this is not the case. It's only natural, normal, part of the process to have certain biases, their own interests. But these interests and biases and their own agendas have to be kept at a minimum. Sometimes these issues come to the forefront and could obstruct a process that's going fine. So one of the issues, and Tom was speaking about the Glion, is the issue of the mandate of these three depository states and the co-conveners when it comes. The three depository states and the co-conveners should not, that's the lesson I learned, should not have a veto on any process, should not decide the outcomes without consulting with the countries of the region. And this has happened. I'm sure there are good reasons for it. I'm sure they have good explanations. But it has affected a positive process. Probably it would not have yielded a serious outcome in the end, but it should not be spoiled by the opinions and the interests of the three depository states. I know this is not very diplomatic of me, but it has affected a process that I have spent many years of my life trying to work through its political pitfalls. The third issue that I would like to speak of is it has become obvious that there is a great need for capacity building. If we are ever going to have a zone, there are technical and legal and political issues. In the technical, you need great capacity building, and the region cannot do it on its own. It requires the help of international organizations, think tanks, research institutes, such as what UNIDIR is doing in that project. And a plan has to be devised. Let's assume there will be a zone in 5 years. Let's assume that, crazy as it might be. So how do we, what is the needs and the requirements? Nobody's looking at that. And we need to look at that on the technical side and on the verification in particular part, because the intention is to have their own verification mechanism, for a regional verification mechanism. Can we do it in the region? I don't think so. We need capacity building, a lot of it, and a lot of help. So these organizations that are working on the issue are essential, and countries of the region have to learn the lesson that they need to learn from and get the knowledge from these institutions working on these issues. Also on the legal side. And on the political side, maybe a bit of negotiation courses could help us negotiate better our position on these issues. These are the main three issues: the role of the depository states, capacity building, and the need for the help of international organizations, and of course, when we come to an agreement on how to talk to each other, we need also the proper setup, because the original ones that we have gone through, whether in the ACRS, which was also informal and no records kept, and then 30 years later, Glion, and the same format was presented, and they both ended up with grief, actually, and misunderstanding and exchanging different stories about what happened there, which we don't need to add to the mix of a very volatile situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Well. Ali, you have been very patient with us. What are some of the main current and regional security developments and issues that may either have positive or negative effects on the Middle East weapon of mass destruction free zone, in your opinion?
Sure. Thank you very much, Ren, for the invitation, and to UNIDIR. It's great to be here. Let me start by echoing something Wael said, which is that I think you really have done. I've been privileged enough to read segments of the report. It's fantastic because not only it's comprehensive, but it rectifies one of the other shortcomings we have in the region. Wael went through a list of them. Is coherence. It's pretty coherent, and it also shows another thing which I was fascinated by, which is the nuances in each country's positions, and that's really a real added value to the debate. Look, right now in the region, we are at an interesting moment in the sense that there are some things in the region that have not changed. Of course, we still have the problem of asymmetries in the region. When it gets to security concerns, we have the problem of haves and have-nots. Of course, we have the fact that for some countries, like Israel, for instance, or I would even put Saudi Arabia in that category, Iran is the biggest threat when it gets to their threat perceptions. But for Iran, the U.S. is its biggest threat perception. It's not Saudi Arabia. You also have asymmetries in conventional capabilities, and of course that creates all sorts of problems for a country like Iran, which has suffered years of arms embargo, unilateral, multilateral. It has basically compensated by investing in what they call a forward defense policy, which is the policy of hiring partners and proxies that would basically deter a direct strike on Iranian soil. And that is something that for Israel, which has the ultimate deterrent, is a primary threat. And so some of these issues have not changed. They have been more or less constant over the years. But what is unique at this moment in the region is the fact that you have both escalation and de-escalation happening in parallel. You have de-escalation that has happened for the first time between Israel and some of the Gulf states, starting with the Abraham Accords, but now also extending to some other countries. You have channels of communication that did not exist between Israel and some GCC states. You have also de-escalation between Turkey and Qatar on the one side and GCC countries on the other. And we have, I would say, most significantly, channels of communication and discussions between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We have had 5 rounds of negotiations mediated by the Iraqis in Baghdad, and constant communication and discussions between the Iranians and the Emiratis. The problem is, in parallel to this de-escalation among regional states, you have also an escalation of tensions between Iran and Israel, especially in the covert realm, and it's a multi-dimensional confrontation that is becoming more and more perilous. You have it in the cyber realm, you have it on open seas, you have it in Syria, you have it in Iraq, but also on Iranian soil, with a series of alleged Israeli operations against Iranian targets, from military to Iran's nuclear facilities and nuclear scientists. And that has created a sense or a deep, deep desire on the Iranian side to restore deterrence by basically retaliating in kind. And of course, one other escalatory pattern is related to the fate of the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. There's been a year and a half of efforts to restore the agreement that President Trump withdrew from in 2018. But those efforts have not yet succeeded, and the prospects of the deal's restoration look increasingly bleak. Of course, the JCPOA's experience, I think, is setting all sorts of precedents for the zone, right? Because the JCPOA itself was a much more narrower subject than the zone, and its sorry fate is going to have implications for what could happen with the zone. Also, the fact that the JCPOA was considered to be the first step addressing an urgent non-proliferation concern on our way to address other security concerns, be it Iran's role in the region or its ballistic missiles program. And of course, not only we didn't have those discussions in the immediate aftermath of the JCPOA, but we've actually spent the past few years trying to salvage whatever remains of this agreement, and all of those other issues have become way worse. So this is where we are in the region. I'm sorry if it doesn't set a very positive tone for the future of the zone, but unfortunately it is what it is.
Thank you, Ali. If we can sort of tie those developments, though, to the zone, how do you think those threats, developments, issues can be addressed either within the zone or as a separate or parallel processes?
Look, again, I think what overshadows all of this debate is the fate of the JCPOA, because if you look at the trajectory of what could potentially come next, if we can't get an agreement to restore the deal, which, as I said, I think it's the likeliest scenario as we speak, then Iran, which already has, for the first time since the beginning of the nuclear crisis, the possibility of having an undetected breakout, will, by the end of the year, reach a situation that would be almost intolerable, I believe, for Israel or even the United States. If we end up in a situation that the West decides, as part of its punitive measures against Iran, to snap back the UN sanctions under UN Resolution 2231, there is a possibility that Iran would withdraw from the NPT altogether. And so then you have a situation that Iran and Israel, that have been two poles in this zone, of course, with Iran always insisting on disarmament before discussions about security, and Israel always insisting on security before disarmament, will be out entirely. Now, this might be a good thing for the zone in some ways, because the other countries that are in between the spectrum, it might be easier to build some consensus, but it also obviously creates a lot of tensions, because it's not like withdrawal from the NPT is the end of the story. It might be the beginning of another escalatory cycle. So that is, I think, where the overlap exists between the JCPOA and the future of the zone.
Thank you. And for those of you that are interested on how we can move from a JCPOA, whether there is restore or not, to the zone, we have one publication that covered that, with many people that were involved directly with the JCPOA negotiations, thinking about how we can learn from that experience to the zone. But indeed, I think, Ali, what you said is that the zone might actually become more urgent and more acute in order to prevent such eventuality. So with that, I would like to open the session right now for Q&A. I will take a couple of questions here, as well as turn to our audience, our virtual audience. So if you can please ask a question, turn your microphone, introduce yourself and your affiliation, and proceed with a question. And if the question is to one of our panelists, please say so. So with that, I will start to spot some of the questions. It seems that we answer all the questions, as well as that we maybe have a zone.
That's interesting.
Okay.
Tom has a question.
Tom has a question? Tom, no. Tom does not have a question. But Manu, do we have any question with our virtual audience? And in the meantime, please, if you have questions, let us know.
Thanks, Ren. Yeah, we do have a few ones. So I'm going to ask 3 of them altogether. The first one is from Hanan Almir from the National Committee for the Prohibition of Weapons in Qatar. What are the procedures and processes to set up confidence-building measures in the region, and especially focusing with the Iranian government, if any? The second one, by Hassan Awad, is what is the UN plan to engage with civil communities in the region to support this cause, including in Israel? So more on the civil society side of things. The third one, by Shamuel Yerushalmi, how can the increasing power and influence of Russia and China contribute to the peace process in the Middle East and conflict resolution between Israel and Iran? Those are the first 3 questions we got.
Thank you, Manu. I will start from this and go down. And any one of you that want to answer any of those 3 questions, please do. So while I think the question for you might be how we can involve civil society and what is the importance of civil society to be involved in such a process that exists today?
Civil society in the region or all over?
Well, let's start with fixing the region.
Yeah. Well, no. Unfortunately, the region has what I consider a weak civil society structure. And they are getting better in the last 2 decades, but not enough. They are not strong enough to create a serious discussion internally in the region alone, on their own. What I have been advising some of these civil society organizations is to work in connection and in affiliation with the international organizations, the civil society at large, who can participate and is interested in issues relating to the Middle East. I have talked about capacity building, and this is one of the areas where a lot of capacity building is needed for the civil society in order to stand and create its own momentum and impact on the policies of the region.
Thank you. To support and promote the zone.
On civil society, I think, and this goes back to the point that I raised earlier, I think one of the things that's impressed me in the workshops that we've held to support the conference up until now has been to try and find a broader group of people to speak at those things as experts. And all those experts have been drawn from civil society. They're either students or working in research institutes. And as I say, the thing that has struck me is how the gender balance has been a lot better, and we've got a lot of younger people participating. So as Wael says, this is already beginning to happen. It is part of the whole capacity thing that he was talking about earlier. And this is where regional actors do play a role in building capacity. I mean, efforts like this, where the EU is supporting a thing on narratives, has already, I think, helped with the understanding. And obviously, other actors are like the UN, the IEA, OPCW, the BWC issue. These are all organizations that have a duty and a mandate to support their member states, to support this process, and they will continue to do so, as Wael has already pointed out. Obviously, the nuclear weapon states have a role to play with CBMs. They'll also be, like on the other nuclear weapon-free zones, will be asked to sign as guarantors for the negative security assurances under the protocols. So they have a role to play in that context as well. And I think another factor when it comes to extra-regional players is arms sales and weapon supplies to this region. I mean, I think greater accountability and transparency, because those arms sales and weapon supplies do exacerbate the problems in some of these areas. So I think there is where greater accountability and transparency, and that's where civil society can also play a role. A lot of civil society used to write reports about this stuff, in the past, and a lot of that funding has dried up, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you. Ali, I think your question was the one about CBMs with the Iranian government, as well as, and Hannah, maybe you want to answer some of those as well afterwards.
I didn't hear the CBM question well, but I wanted to actually say a few things about the Russia-China question. So, you know, when Hannah was talking about the ACRS process and the fact that there was this moment in time where all the stars had aligned, I also remember that this is the case with the JCPOA as well, that in 2015 you had a situation that basically not only there was political will on all sides, but you also had in multilateral diplomacy this unique moment that all the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and Germany all wanted the same thing, as well as Iran, of course, and the deal was possible. Right now, Russia and China are still supportive of the JCPOA, but they're not putting as much energy into it, and they're not as proactive when it gets to the diplomatic effort to try to bring the parties to the finish line, as was the case in 2015. And I'm afraid with growing tensions between the West and Russia and China, we might see less of this in the future, which again would have an impact for the prospects of the zone as well. Also, you know, Russia and China are uniquely, I think, in this position that they have very good relations with all sides in the Middle East. Russia especially has really good relations with Iran, Israel, GCC countries. But they have not expended political capital and trying to actually reduce tensions, even, you know, encourage confidence building between the parties. We've not seen any of these efforts from Russia and China. I think it's high time for them to start playing this role.
Thank you. Hannah?
Yeah, I mean, the gentleman asked about confidence-building measures with Iran. Now, during ACRS, Iran was not at the table, but still a lot can be said about how confidence-building measures were done at that time. There was a regionalization of the process going on. So first of all, the main ACRS plenaries initially happened in Moscow and Washington, but were moved to the region. You had them in Tunis, you had them in Doha. And then in the operational basket, where confidence-building measures on maritime security, incidents at sea, search and rescue, pre-notification of military activities, and other things were worked out, a lot of that activity also happened in the region. There were third parties, countries like Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, or Turkey that supported and shepherded that process. And certainly there was a lot of activity also taking place outside of the region, but there was a lot going on in the region as well. Speaking to sort of capacity building, that was really, that was on the minds of people at the time who organized those activities. And importantly, ACRS delegates felt that the fact that you were doing this in the region, you were going to Tunis, to Amman, to Cairo to conduct these kinds of meetings, generated a greater stake by the regional players in wanting to see this process through. So that's something I would say on the confidence-building measures.
Thank you. I'm trying to see if there are any questions here. Yes. I think it's Sharon. Yes, it's Sharon.
But a comment, or one of the questions was about civil society and campaigning and talking to Israelis, and I just wanted to say that I think that civil society, I forgot to say I'm from the Middle East Treaty Organization, METO. I think that one of the most important things that civil society can do, and is important that civil society will do, is to imagine. I mean, we have the power to imagine or to think what can happen if states will want the zone. We don't have to stay in the path of obstacles, but we can take a bird fly and look at what are the paths that can move us forward and then do that, which is something that we've done with our draft treaty. But I think that about the campaign in Israel that I thought that was the question about, the campaign in Israel is not as impossible as some people will think. I mean, in Israel live people that when they hear about the humanitarian catastrophic consequences of any nuclear war, people in Israel would like to disarm. They just want to do it in a way that they will feel safe to do so. And as civil society, it's very important that we will do exactly that. I think that it's time that civil society organizations will start working together, hand in hand, in order to give as much information as possible to people in Israel about the way to do so safely. And you are all invited to join us with that. Thank you. Great panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Any other questions there? Yes.
So can you hear me? Yeah. So Leonardo Bandaja from the Informeto and also from the University of Duisburg-Essen. So I have a question on the ACRS process, on the sources that you had for the project. So as Hannah said in her presentation, it was an informal process. And one of the things for that was that there was not much written recordings. So my question would be, there are two questions actually. The first one is how you overcome this lack of written information, and what do you think, that's an open for all the panelists, were the consequences of that for the further process? Thank you.
I mean, I would just briefly say for ACRS that even though no official records were taken, it was possible to garner a lot of information on this process, which we have done in this project over the last 2 years. So first of all, interviewing delegates who directly participated in the process, we managed to speak with over 40 US, Egyptian, Israeli, Jordanian, Kuwaiti, Palestinian, Turks, Dutch, Canadians, others, so quite a lot of people. Of course, they have to remember what transpired 30 years ago, so that might sort of skew some of the, some of the information that is being shared, but there's a lot of wealth of information there. Then we also gathered a lot of previously unpublished documents that were kept by individual delegations, correspondence between parties, meeting agendas, participant lists. And then there's also archival material available in the Bush and Clinton presidential libraries. So even though you don't have this official record, you do have a wealth of material that you can turn to and study this process. It might not be perfect, but it is quite a lot.
And I believe that you're going to make it available in October.
In October, yes, the Wilson Center will publish, thank you, Ren, a digital archive where all of this information will be published alongside a big analytical study that will draw the lessons from the ACRS process, from the process design, the format, how it was conceived, the problems that emerged over time. And I hope it will be of use to current and future processes.
Thank you. I think this question is very important because the events that happened in ACRS, a few documents came out, research papers expressing the views of what happened, and they were controversial because it reflected either an American point of view, an Egyptian point of view, an Israeli point of view, and they were divergent, they were not aligned. This is why a project like the UNIDIR is doing has been something in my mind a long way where you can bring all views together, when you can have a round-up vision of what happened. You take what you want from this with a grain of salt, because they are, in the end, personal interviews done with people. But at least when you look at these personal points of view, you see all the points of view of people who were there at one point, and then it's up to you to, that's the best thing we can come up when you have unrecorded meetings that are very important and people are talking about, they want to know what happened there. So these projects, and there has been other efforts also collecting from people who were participating in the ACRS and in 1995, because some of them are as old as me or older, and they are not available anymore, some of them. So it's important to now record their experiences and what they have done during these meetings before they are gone. Thank you.
Thank you. I will take one more question from our virtual audience. Is there any question here that... I don't see anyone. Manu.
Quick questions. One is directed to Mr. Al-Assad. Did the parties to the Treaty of Pelindaba establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in Africa face any technical, legal, or political issues similar to those faced by the potential parties to a Middle East WMD-Free Zone? That's first question. Second question is from Marjolein van Dielen from the European Union. How can the reports by UNIDIR under this project be used effectively for capacity building, and how can they be helpful to participants in the November conference? that thing for the UNIDIR team. But the first one was for you.
On the Pelindaba Treaty, it faced some questions in the beginning because some of the countries of Africa are already involved in the Middle East attempt at creating a zone. And that created some debate on how can they deal with that and still continue with. But otherwise, Africa has been, after South Africa gave up its weapons, it became a non-issue to them. Actually, it became a plus for them to move forward towards the zone. Yet, it took many years to get there. It wasn't an easy process. Such a treaty is never easy. And because it involves not only countries of the region, but or the continent, but also extra regional states that should help the process. So it took years, but it wasn't very complicated. I mean, if you compare it to other treaties, regional treaties, this could have been the simplest of them.
Thank you. Tom, do you want to comment on any of that?
I think Wael has summed it up, and as a South African, I can be quite open here and say it wasn't until the South Africans actually got rid of their program and were seriously moving on the road to democracy that they participated in the thing could actually move forward, and it languished in many African corridors for many years prior to that. And there, I think there's some similarities, obviously, with the current situation, and it'll be more the question of how you deal with eliminating a program by a country in the region that does possess nuclear weapons, and how you go about doing it. Do you do it before the time, like the South Africans did, or do you do it afterwards? You know, and that the treaty is going to have to grapple with when it gets to that point. But as well pointed out, there are a lot of other players that do assist in that process, like they did in Pelindaba. It had also some extra territorial issues that it had to deal with as well, and the same will be the case here. And there are similarities between all of these zones, but at the end of the day, they have to be built for the unique characteristics of the zone, and also having a WMD zone is just going to complicate things far more. So while there are some lessons to be learned, there aren't that many either. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom, do you want to answer? And obviously, either Ali or Hannah can speak after that about Ambassador Van Dillen's question of how what we are producing and the depth of knowledge can be helpful to the current process or any future processes.
I think all of these things do help. And I mean, I think a project like this does a tremendous task in providing all the material, as Wael has already said as well. And I think these things have to be really, the more of this kind of work we can do, the more it does help. I mean, I think the conference going forward will have its own workshops and intersessionals to deal with, but they will be inviting many people that are already building up these bodies of work to hopefully participate in many of those things so they can develop the understandings, learn the lessons from this. But at the end of the day, you can only do so much. It's up to the countries in that region to decide for themselves what they want done to procure their own security in a regional context, and that only they can decide upon. But all of these lessons from the past, and that's why I'm so glad that the ACRS project is also beginning to crystallize and bring these things out, and the same as what has been done on these narratives now. Many people have not had access to all this material, all brought together in one place and easy to read and easy to comprehend. And having meetings like this also does contribute to this. So, yep, absolutely. It does play a role, and I'm hoping that the conference participants going forward will actually utilize all these resources.
Thank you, Tom. Farzan, you had some comments to add to that aspect?
Yeah, so I think in the Zone project, we've had an opportunity to produce a range of work, and I'll illustrate some of them. So on the one hand, I think the narratives effort is something wider to give a kind of a big perspective on different aspects of the zone from the perspective of people who've worked on the zone for nearly 50 years. And so this is a kind of a reference that people can go into for the history, to look at positions on specific things. Moving along the spectrum, we also have works that are like the timeline of milestones. So if you're interested in looking at a very specific event and seeing any documents associated with that, you can see this on our timeline and our documents depository. And finally, we have kind of technical works which address specific technical issues related to the zone and possible solutions. One is the kind of lessons from the JCPOA for the zone publication, and another is the nuclear verification in the Middle East WMD-Free Zone. And you can find all of our publications on the back of this brochure. There's a QR code, and this will allow you to access these publications based on what you're doing. So to address Ambassador van der Leyen's questions, we kind of have produced a range of work suitable for a variety of audiences, and we've already had very positive feedback in terms of the utility of these tools for diplomats looking at the zone and looking at Middle East disarmament issues from a variety of countries. But that being said, I think in the post-pandemic context and also in terms of the needs of the actual ongoing zone process, there's a number of more things we can do. And from my end, I'd just like to conclude with two comments that we received from the virtual audience from Ambassador Sultania, former ambassador from Iran. The one regarded the U.S. decision to indefinitely postpone the zone conference in 2012, disregarding, from his perspective, the unanimous decision from the NPT in 2010, and the lessons that has potentially in terms of the role of extra-regional actors. And the other, which is the other comment from Ambassador Sultania, which is particularly timely in the context of the conflict going on in Ukraine, is the kind of protection of armed attack in the Middle East in terms of nuclear facilities, and to a potential CBM that can be done around having the immunity of nuclear facilities in the Middle East from armed attacks. So just something to keep in mind.
Thank you. Ali, if you want to comment on any of them. And Hannah, you okay with that? Okay. So it is my pleasure to conclude the event today. Please join me in thanking our distinguished speakers and all of you that, for coming and contributing to our event today. Thank you.